Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Jackie. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this morning on the impact of COVID-19 on B-BBEE and transformation. The effects of COVID-19 will have far-reaching effects on businesses, both big and small. So irrespective of the size of your business, I think we're all going to feel the effects of COVID-19 for some time, even after this lockdown period is over. There's a lot of uncertainty with respect to the economy, how long the lockdown will continue, and how we will recover from it. We have already seen the lockdown being extended for a further 2 weeks from the initial 21-day period, and depending on the type of industry you operate in, the level of continuity of your business will vary. So we've seen some businesses closing doors over this period with little or no income, some who continue to operate remotely as best they can, and then if you are providing an essential service, you are probably continuing along almost as normal, just with some minor changes. So yeah, a very different environment that we are working in. As we also all know, when we look at B-BBEE, it's generally an ongoing process that we follow during the course of the year. So towards the beginning of your financial year, we would start to look at strategies, and then we would implement these strategies and monitor them on an ongoing basis throughout the year. And these strategies are normally very dependent on the nature of the business and what the business needs are. And as a result of these unusual circumstances that we found ourselves in, many clients have now asked us to start to relook at their BEE strategy for the upcoming year. And as such, we've started to revisit some of the elements of the scorecard. So what we're going to do in today's webinar is we're going to look at two of the elements of the scorecards that we believe could be fundamentally impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And on Tuesday, we then will look at the other three elements. So hopefully you can all join us on Tuesday again as we unpack those elements. So we're going to look at management control and ownership this morning. And also I'll cover one or two general comments towards the end of the webinar. So if we have a look at ownership, we know that there are 25 points available on the ownership element, and that those points are scored based on ownership by Black natural persons. So it looks all the way through all the corporate structures to the actual human at the end of the chain. What you need to also remember is that it's measured at a point in time. So ownership is one of the elements that are measured on your day of verification. So you can continue to look at it, you can continue to change it right up to your day of verification. So what we must also remember is that it's a priority element. So what that means is you have to achieve 40% of, and in the case of ownership, it's the net value points, 40% of 8 points, which is 3.2 points to avoid being discounted a level. Ownership is a priority element for both the QSE scorecard and the generic scorecard. So irrespective of whether you are a large organization or a medium-sized organization, you would need to meet the 40% on the net value calculation. If we look at the ownership scorecard, it is broken down into three sort of sub elements or sub indicators. The one is voting rights, which I'm not going to talk about at any length today, because I don't think there would be a significant effect on voting rights in terms of the current circumstance we find ourselves in. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the economic interest and then also the realization points or the net value, because these are the two areas where I think we would see an impact in terms of the ownership scorecard. So if we move on to economic interest, so what is economic interest? Economic interest is the level of participation in the measured entity by the black shareholder. The target in terms of the codes is 25%, of which 10% should be black women if you want to maximize your points. And in order to score the points, you need to evidence that there is economic participation by your black shareholders in the business. And historically and up to now, the easiest way to evidence the economic participation by your black shareholders would be their participation in dividends declared. What we are seeing now is, as a result of COVID-19 and other economic factors, that it's anticipated that there will be a decline in company profits and that many companies may not declare dividends. So that then leaves the question, well, how do you then demonstrate economic or evidence, demonstrate or evidence that there's economic interest in these circumstances when you get to the point of verification and your verification agent is on site to check all your documentation? And I think the main way that you would demonstrate this is to demonstrate the economic entitlement of your black shareholder. And you would do this by giving your verification agency a copy of your memorandum of incorporation. In your memorandum of incorporation, it should set out very clearly what the rights are that are attached to the different classes of shares, and how the shareholders participate in the company and in the returns from the company. So that's a very important document that you would have to give to your verification agency. The other document is the shareholders agreement, because in most cases, when these types of transactions are entered into or structures are put in place, a shareholders agreement is drawn up, which governs then the relationship between the two shareholders. And in that agreement, it will also lay out additional factors that may or may not be in the MOI that govern the relationship and the rights and entitlements of the specific shareholders. Another good way would be if you've got a past history of declaring dividends, or alternatively, if you've got a dividend policy in place, and you can evidence these through to your verification agent, either in the form of supplying them with copies of past resolutions, copies of minutes of meetings where these matters have been discussed and debated and agreed upon between the shareholders. So that's also a good way to evidence the right to, or the entitlement to, economic interest by the black shareholder. And then lastly, all of the above would then be supplemented with a detailed representation letter, director's representation letter, where you explain the economic entitlement of the black shareholder, and you then also explain the current circumstance the company is finding itself in, and also explaining that at the point when the company is then in a position to continue to declare dividends, they would then be declared to the shareholders based on the rights as have been laid out in the various documents mentioned above. So all important documentations and important evidence and documentary evidence that you could then supply to your verification agency to evidence the economic interest of your black shareholders. If you are able to do this, you should then be able to score the points under the economic interest element of the scorecard. So yeah, I think in terms of economic interests, I think provided you can evidence the entitlement, you should be able to then score your points on that element. If we then move on to the realization points for net value, this is the area where I think we will find the most significant impact on the measured entity scorecard, because this is also the area that where your priority element comes into play. So it's on the realization points where you need to achieve your 40%. And what we need to think about is, well, how is the net value calculated? So the net value points are based on the level of debt attaching to the shares held by the black shareholders relative to the value of the business. And it's also based on a time graduation factor. So if you look at the codes, there's a period over which the codes require the debt on the the debt on the shares to be repaid, and that ultimately the black shareholder then would have unencumbered shares that they would be the owner of. Now, if we look at that time-based graduation factor, in the first year that a structure in place, it would be 10% of the debt would need to be repaid. The second year, 20%. The third and fourth year, 40% of the debt would need to be repaid. 60% in the fifth year, 80% in the, 60% in the fifth and sixth year, 80% in the seventh and eighth year. And then essentially by the first day of the ninth year, there should be no debt attached to the shares. So what does that mean? If we look at the impact of COVID-19 and what does it mean in the context of your net value calculation, as I've alluded to before, I mean, we are experiencing a very tough trading environment. We have the lockdown in place currently. And the uncertainties around that. We are currently in a recession, and we've experienced a rating agency's downgrade. We know that there is anticipated that there would be a decline in company profits, and we will find that companies will either not be in a position to pay a dividend. So if they do the tests in terms of the Companies Act with respect to solvency and liquidity, they may not meet the requirements and may be unable to pay a dividend, or they may they may elect to withhold dividends in order to build up cash reserves to have a sustainable business going forward into the future. So, so they may then just elect to withhold dividends. As a consequence, what we will find is where there is debt, black shareholders will not have the ability to apply the dividends to service the outstanding debt on the shares. So what you often find is, in practice, is the company declares and pays a dividend. The black shareholder will then use portion or all of that dividend to service some of the outstanding debt on the shares, thus reducing the debt. So we will find that as a consequence of no dividend, black shareholders would not be able to pay off the outstanding debt. To compound this, we potentially will experience the value of the businesses declining because trading has declined due to the current circumstances. So we need to then look at three different scenarios that could occur. So the first scenario is that you have a black shareholder and there's no debt attached to those shares. And I suppose that is first prize. That is the best position to be in the current circumstance, because if there's no debt attached to the shares, you essentially will meet your net value, your net value targets, and you wouldn't have a problem. But the reality is that when we look at most of the BEE structures that have been put in place, there is generally a level of debt that is involved. So if we look at the next scenario, then where your value of the business has decreased. So in this instance, the debt on the shares has remained the same, because there has not been any repayment of the debt, but your value of your business decreases. In those circumstances, if the net value calculation is to be met, the black shareholder would need to increase his debt repayment in order to get the correct proportions of the debt relative to the value of the business. So this would put extra pressure on the black shareholder, to be able to pay more debt. Now, if more of the debt. Now, if he is reliant on the dividends from the measured entity, you can see it's a snowball effect in terms of that calculation. Which then brings us to the third case, where there is an inability to repay debt by the black shareholder. So, and that is the scenario where there's no dividends from the measured entity to service that debt. And what is the implication of that? So, depending on the agreements that underlie the particular debt, we may see that the black shareholder is now defaulting on obligations in terms of signed agreements to either the vendor or the shareholder, alternatively to the bank or to a third party. So essentially, any one of those types of organizations may have funded the debt. So there may be a default. And what would the consequence of that be? The consequence of that would be that the shares potentially would be forfeited or alternatively attached in terms of the default clauses in these agreements. So all of these things have quite serious implications, and essentially the ultimate risk is that you won't meet your net value targets, and this would potentially result in you being discounted a level in terms of your BEE score when you are verified. Some possible solutions, depending on the nature of the debt. So maybe it's possible that a portion of the debt could be waived. There, though, it would be important that the tax implications and the company tax implications of these types of transactions are considered, and that specific advice is sought to make sure that these are complied with. This is a lot easier to do if the debt is vendor or shareholder financed, because then it would be easier to enter into a negotiation in terms of a debt waiver in those types of circumstances, because the parties would in essence be known to one another. They would be in a fairly close business relationship as it is. So a lot easier if it's vendor or shareholder financing involved. If there's third party or bank financing involved, you probably would find it very unusual for there to be a waiver of debt. If we then look at another possible solution, that would be to obtain a new third-party independent valuation to support a higher value of the business, which would assist in a more favorable net value calculation. The risk with that is in our current circumstances and the current economic climate that we find ourselves in, what a third-party valuer would do is they would look at your past trends in terms of your business. They would look at the future prospects, potential contracts you've got in place into the future, and then they would make an assessment in terms of and they would also look at the economy, and based on all of these factors, they would then determine what the value of your business is as an independent person. Now, this may support a higher value, but it may also support a lower value. But what it will do is give you a good benchmark in terms of, well, what is your ultimate goal, and give you the ability to then look at possible ways of solving the net value dilemma with a good starting point. And then the third possible option is to possibly relook at restructuring the balance sheet of the measured entity, and that could be done by converting debt into equity, and this may be in the form of a preference share. Again, here you would need to look quite closely at both the Companies Act and tax implications of doing these types of restructures. So I think from a BEE point of view, I think this is the area which, from an ownership perspective, carries the greatest risk, and needs to be looked at very closely sooner rather than later, especially if you are coming up for verification shortly after the lockdown period, or in the next couple of months. What we need to also think about, though, is we mustn't see it all as negative, because this does potentially create some opportunities. So some of the opportunities that this may create is it may now give you the opportunity to renegotiate the price of the shares held by your black shareholders. So that is the one area of opportunity, and going hand in hand, to the extent that there is debt, possibly a renegotiation of the debt. We spoke about the waivers in the previous slide. So I mean, I think those are both opportunities that could be looked at. The other opportunity, which could potentially be quite a favorable opportunity, is, if you had looked at a possible BEE structure in the past, a BEE ownership structure, and you'd looked at this, and negotiations fell down as a result of possibly price. Maybe you couldn't, the potential investor felt that the price was too high, or financing couldn't be secured for the level of the level that needed to be secured in terms of the price. Possibly now is an opportune time to look those, because with potentially the value of a business falling, it now gives the opportunity for a black shareholder to potentially buy in at a lower price on more favorable terms, and thus assisting you in meeting your ultimate long-term objectives in terms of BBBEE sooner in that area. So I think definitely some opportunities that we mustn't lose sight of, that could come out of everything that's happening at the moment. So I think that essentially covers most of what I wanted to chat about in terms of ownership. So certainly a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to consider. And I think it's definitely something that, as a measured entity, you need to start to monitor and look at now, sooner rather than later, so that you can be better prepared in terms of what the ultimate outcome is. The second element that I'd like to just touch on briefly today is the management control element. Now, management control element is similar to ownership. It's measured at a point in time. So the verification agency is going to look at it at your day of verification. Now, in theory, it should be on the actual day of verification. In practice, they would normally look at your closest month end. What we need to bear in mind when we're looking at the management control scorecard, if you are a large organization, you need to consider the demographic of the economically active population in terms of your your workforce. What that essentially means is if in terms of the statistics, they say that the 40% of the workforce in South Africa is black male. You need to target 40% black males in terms of your workforce. If they say it's included is 30% colored females, you would need to try and build 30% of colored females into your workforce. So that would be your target if you were a large organization. And you would have put strategies in place around reaching those targets. If you're a QSE, it's a little bit easier from a management control perspective, because there is then just a distinction between black or white. What is also good to note is management control is not a priority element, so there are no sub-minimums that need to be met in terms of the management control element. So you can't be discounted if you don't score large points in this area. So that is a positive. Obviously, you would want to maximize your points to improve your overall score. So if we look at where we are at the moment, we would probably find that most of our existing strategies are out the window, because we're working in very unusual circumstances. The businesses are under pressure. They may be looking at restructuring their workforce, and that restructuring process would either be through voluntary severance packages or retrenchments or one of these types of mechanisms. And what you need to be cognizant of, and what is very important, is that when you are following all of these types of restructuring processes, that you follow the correct HR processes. So there needs to be a fair selection criterion, irrespective of the race and gender. So you can't look at these restructuring exercises and do it for the purposes of BEE. So you need to look at all of your staff, and there needs to be a fair process in terms of the restructuring process. What this means from a BEE perspective is, as I say, the existing strategies that were potentially put in place would no longer be applicable. So as soon as you know what the look and feel of your workforce is going to be post the lockdown period, I think it's going to be important to re-look your HR strategies if they have been fundamentally impacted. So first step would be to benchmark, okay, after the lockdown period, what is the new normal? How are we scoring, and what do we do now going forward? So I think that is the very important thing from a management control perspective. So I think from that point of view, that's all I wanted to essentially cover. Just to also say, at this stage, we've seen no correspondence around any relaxation of any of the BEE requirements. Obviously, we'll keep in touch if anything does come out. That then brings me to the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope you have a lovely Friday. Thanks very much.